So thank you everybody for joining us in the Spring 2021 Faculty Forum. A few housekeeping reminders here that this presentation is being recorded, and that during the time of the presentation, it would be really helpful if you can check that your microphone is muted, just to avoid having extraneous noises. And also that obviously we would encourage participation through questions and answers. So you are welcome to unmute yourself at the end of the presentation, or if you prefer, you can type your questions in the chat box, and I will be monitoring that and forward those questions on to our speaker today as appropriate. So let me give a very brief introduction for our speaker today, Roxanne Backowski, and thank you, Roxanne, for joining us. So Roxanne is an assistant professor and the head of electronic resources and acquisitions at UW-Eau Claire. She's been working at the library since 2017. Her research interests include library resource use related to equity, diversity, and inclusivity efforts, collaborating with instructional designers, and the use of plain language in academic libraries. So thank you again, Roxanne, for joining us, and everybody for attending this forum, and I will turn over to you, Roxanne.
Thanks for the introduction, Catherine. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here, so give me a second to do that. Okay, so you should be seeing my first slide and not my notes. Okay, thanks for confirming. Well, yeah, thanks for the introduction, Catherine. I'm honored to be here, and thanks for all of you attending. I'm a regular attendee over the years of the Faculty Forum, and I have really enjoyed learning about everyone's research at UW-Eau Claire, and I'm pleased to get the opportunity to share mine. So let's get right into it. I'm going to start with the findings of my research right away. I'm not going to keep you in suspense. And then I'll go into the research methods I used and so on and so forth. So let's move right to the conclusions of my research. Instructors at UW-Eau Claire are responding to campus diversity initiatives and changing their curricular materials they assign students. This growth is partly explained by the introduction of the responsibility outcomes in the liberal education core framework, as well as the university expectations of contributions to equity, diversity, and inclusivity. How does the library fit into this? Well, I also explored the use of library content since the implementation of the liberal education core framework and the expectations of contributions to EDI. I found concurrent demand for library content related to EDI when these initiatives were going into effect. So the rate of use of ebooks related to EDI slightly increased during this period. Now that I shared my conclusions, how did I find this out? Let's back up just a little bit. For most of you attending today, this is familiar to you and probably a refresher, but I was incorporating two campus diversity initiatives into my research. The first one is the personnel measure that went into effect in 2018. That all reviews of employees include an evaluation of a faculty or staff member's EDI engagement. These contributions can be demonstrated through teaching, curricular development, scholarly activity, engagement in initiatives that directly serve underrepresented communities, and professional development. As Catherine mentioned, I started here at UW-Eau Claire in January 2017. So this article that was published in Inside Higher Education, as well as the news generally that this personnel measure was going into effect, was I was aware of it when I was hired, and it was very much, I knew it was going to effect, so it was very much impactful and at the forefront of my work. I knew the university valued this and was heading into this direction. So the second diversity initiative that I factored into my research is the Liberal Education Core Framework. This was implemented in the 2016-2017 academic year and included new EDI curriculum requirements. The liberal education core framework replaced the general education program. It lays out 4 learning goals, and the 4 learning goals of liberal education and 11 outcomes that each undergraduate must meet. One of those goals is responsibility, and one of the learning outcomes underneath, actually two of the responsibility learning outcomes relate directly to EDI. For example, R1 learning outcome under responsibility is use critical and analytical skills to evaluate assumptions and challenge existing structures in ways that respect diversity and foster equity and inclusivity. Okay, so I incorporated these 2 diversity initiatives into my research. I'm going to put that aside for a second, and then I'm going to kind of talk about my work generally. The majority of my work as a librarian at UW-Eau Claire includes managing what we call in the library world electronic resources. Those are the databases, the journals, the ebooks, and the journals the library subscribes to and provides access to for the university. We do this to support the teaching and research and learning needs of the university. And our collections reflect the academic programs and curriculum of the university. The electronic resources, the library can actually gather usage stats to see how many times an ebook chapter is downloaded or viewed, how many times a journal article is downloaded. And one of the regular parts of my work is reviewing these usage statistics when we're looking at renewals about what is being used. And the vendors provide these to the library, and publishers also provide them in a standardized format. I'm sharing this because in my regular work, I happen to compare the top 20 ebook titles from academic year 2014 to 2015 against the academic year 2017-2018. So the top 20 ebook titles for both of these 2 academic years. And while I was looking at this, what caught my eye was the increased number of ebook titles in the top 20 that were content about non-dominant cultures or identities, content about intercultural communication, interpersonal communication, or what I could quickly categorize as titles that could possibly be used in an EDI context. And it went from 3 titles in academic year 14-15 to up to 12 in 2017-2018. I noticed this just as part of my regular work, and it led to more questions. I wondered if this increase of titles went past the top 20 titles. This is just a snapshot of one vendor's or one publisher's title list. And so I wondered if I could see this usage in other ebook packages that we have. And then I started thinking more broadly too, what is driving the usage, the supposed increase of the EDI related titles? We know in the library that curriculum and faculty choices impact library usage. For example, on the right-hand side, the top used title in academic year 17-18 is The Late Homecomer. And we know that is taught in English classes. There were over 6,000 ebook chapter downloads in that year. And we know in the library through our liaison relationships, through requests, that this title in particular is being used. And when we look at the usage stats and see that there's 6,000, that's likely not just because it's a popular title, even though it is a wonderful book. I recommend it. But when usage gets this high, looking at ebook stats, it's usually because an instructor has assigned it as a required course reading in their class. Now I'm going to sort of tie back in those campus diversity initiatives. So I knew those were happening at the same time, and this sort of led me to guessing that the faculty and the instructors on campus were changing their curricular choices because of the curriculum changes and the personnel measure related to EDI expectations. This led me to my formal research question. Are UW-Eau Claire instructors changing the required materials they assign to students as a result of the 2 campus diversity initiatives? And what is the impact on library ebook collections? I am now going to move into talking about collection assessment within librarianship, and especially collection assessment related to trying to evaluate collections for diversity. So this table here is from the 2010 article, Diversity Collection Assessment in Large Academic Libraries. The work in this table is actually based on a researcher named Peggy Johnson from 2004, but this article had a nice visual for purposes of this presentation. And you can see that there are 2 scopes of assessment for collection analysis within librarianship. There's user-centered and there's collection-centered. And then within those scopes, the nature of the assessment can either be quantitative or qualitative. I used a mixed methods approach with my research. And I used a user-centered methods because this research is trying to hopefully trying to tie the curricular needs and changes in relation to the campus diversity initiatives to explain usage of library collections. Just a note about the collection-centered assessment. This assessment method is used if a library wants to determine that if there are gaps in their collection, if their collection is not representative of the populations that they're seeking to serve. And there is research being done on this topic, and I would say in my review of the literature, there's more research being done on the collection-centered scope of assessment than the user-centered. My perspective with doing this research is that it's essential that academic libraries link assessment and especially collection assessment to the university's values, goals, and interests. Academic libraries have moved from a collection-centric model to a engagement-based model of teaching, learning, and research. And we want to provide value in the context of the institution. So the library excellence should be determined in the context of the strategic fit to the university interests. So that's why I wanted to, it made sense to go with a user-centered assessment. Before I move on to my research methods and the results of the survey, I do want to share a little bit about collection-centered assessment. I wasn't sure where to fit this in the presentation. I had it at the end. It didn't quite make sense there. And so I thought I'd throw it in here. And this is just to sort of give you a taste of what collection-centered assessment is like. So I presented with Tim Morton, who works at the University of Virginia and is applying the idea of own voices to evaluating UVA's African Studies collection. Own voices is a term coined by the writer Corinne Duvise, and it refers to when an author from a marginalized or underrepresented group writes about their experiences and from their own perspective, rather than someone outside the group writing about that group. So my co-presenter Tim at the University of Virginia was trying to fit this to academic libraries, this model of own voices. Public libraries have taken this on to some extent. And what he was experimenting with was using the place of publication as a proxy for own voices characteristics. So when they were looking at their African Studies collection, they were looking at where the books were published to see if that would give insight into if a title was own voices or not. They also used library classification, Library of Congress classification, and subject headings in there, which within collection-centered assessment in librarianship is problematic because the language is problematic and there's a colonial bias. But what my co-presenter Tim Morton at the University of Virginia found in his research is that there is a perceptible bias in their collection towards tragedies and American national interests, regardless of the place of publication of the book. and that they need to establish relationships with new vendors to effectively acquire African content. The University of Virginia is a very large library, and they had reasons for doing the African studies. So sometimes libraries focus on a specific area of their collections. Another example of collection-centered assessment is using diversity literary awards and then comparing to peers to see how collections compare. So Laurel Christic at Oregon State University Library established a bibliography of using 22 different diversity awards, and she came up with 2,400 titles. She looked to see how many Oregon State University had, and they had 22% of those titles. And then they compared to the peer institutions to benchmark, how they were doing. What they ended up finding was they had significantly higher percentage of titles that cover persons with disabilities, multiculturalism, and Asian Americans, but they had gaps in titles about Latinx and Native Americans. Penn State University Libraries, Julie Proctor, a researcher from there, also used diversity literary awards and peer comparison as a tool to do collection assessment. Specifically, though, that Julie focused on LGBTQ content. Julie's research concluded with more questions than answers, but did recommend a mixed methods approach. There are other smaller examples of diversity collection assessment that are happening. Another term we use for it in librarianship is diversity audits of our collection. There's one from the University of California, Irvine, who is looking at play scripts and who is publishing play scripts. And then there's a lot of examples of looking at children's and young adult diversity collection audits as well. So those are a couple examples. I should mention, these are recently published within the last 2 or 3 years studies. The table that I presented from 2010 is quite dated, but there is more publication and research happening in this area, which is good to see. So now I'm going to switch back to my study and my research methods. As I said, I took a mixed methods approach with this, and one of my qualitative methods was a survey. So the audience for the survey was faculty and instructional academic staff. It was designed to elicit a large number of responses about instructors' curricular choices and the reading materials they assigned students. It also included questions like what's involved with the identification process for assigned course materials and how the library is included in that. The survey had 12 questions, took less than 5 minutes to complete. The second method, second qualitative method, was a focus group. At the end of the survey, I gave respondents an option to volunteer for a focus group. The questions are meant to go into depth about the process of identifying, selecting, and assigning course readings, and then what the library could do to make it easier to assign these course readings. This nuance couldn't necessarily be gleaned from the survey, especially if I wanted to keep it short and hope for a higher response rate. So that was the focus group. And then the third research method is also still user-centered, but is quantitative. And that was related to the ebook usage. I specifically focused on ebook usage and not print usage because I had those statistics easily available to me. And so my goal with using the ebook usage was to determine the rate of use of EDI-related titles over 3 academic years. Those academic years lined up with right after the liberal education core framework was implemented, and then I think it was sort of before and after the personnel measure of EDI expectations was implemented. So with these ebook titles, I ended up looking at 12,000 ebook titles total, and I gave a yes/no determination based on anything that could be used in an EDI context. The criteria I used is on the screen here: the content about a non-dominant culture, content about identities, content about intercultural and interpersonal communication, social scientific literature, and professional development material. I will mention at this point a major limitation with this part of my survey is that, and I've seen this in the literature, any method of collection assessment in regard to diversities is going to require, at least right now, a definition on the researcher's part, and therefore is subjective. So a disclaimer, there's only one person, me, a white cisgendered female, that was looking and categorizing this data. And I acknowledge that my privilege and biases are likely to show. Okay, so those are the methods I used. Let's move on to the results. And let's start with the survey. So the survey, I received 84 responses, which was a 15% response rate. And I'll start with some of the less exciting results. I asked what types of materials are assigned as course readings or assigned course materials. Most commonly journal articles, book excerpts, or chapters, and videos are assigned. And videos, I think maybe even more so recently, that was not a surprise to me. When instructors are deciding on requiring a material, I asked about the most important considerations, and the top three were meeting the course objectives and learning outcomes, the argument and perspective presented, and then availability. And availability is an interesting one because some of the additional survey results, I asked, okay, after instructors identify materials to incorporate into their courses, I learned that 40% always check to see if the library provides access. 40% always check to see if the library provides access after identifying a material to incorporate into their courses. 35% of respondents sometimes check, and then the rest never or rarely check. Additionally, 77% of respondents said that they are more likely to include content in their assigned course materials if it is available electronically through the library. This survey and this focus group and the ebook data categorization took place in spring 2019. So that was before COVID. I don't have any data on if this number has changed, but 77% said they're likely to include it if it's electronically. And as we've moved to more online courses due to necessity, this number maybe has increased. Another question I asked was about when instructors prepare to teach a course again, how many readings they add or swap out. And when preparing to teach a course again, up to 75% said they swap out a quarter of the readings. Some swap out up to half, and then a little bit less than 10% swap out more than half. And part of the reason for asking this question was to try and see the rate of turnover of materials being used as course assignments, which might have a correlation to ebook stats and ebook usage. I will note here, there's a small survey flaw, design flaw. We forgot to give a percentage of 0. So if there is a time where an instructor has taught a course again and did not change out any content, I'm guessing they probably would have put their answer of up to a quarter of content being swapped out. So a small note there. Now, continuing on with the qualitative methods in the survey, I'm kind of getting to the crux of the survey. So I had already asked about identifying course content and how the library is involved. But then I asked this question. And I stated in 2018, the UW-Eau Claire adopted a personnel measure that requires employees to be evaluated on their contribution to the university efforts toward EDI. And then, did you adapt or develop a course as a result of this personnel measure? Yes or no? I asked this same question in relation to the liberal education core framework, with a yes or no answer. So respondents may have adopted a course either due to the LE core or the personnel measure and EDI expectations. And if they said yes to either of these questions, then I asked them this question. If you did adopt a course or develop a course, did you incorporate reading materials related to EDI or social responsibility? And then with the options of saying to what extent. The results from these questions. So overall, about 40% of survey respondents said yes, that they either adopted a course due to the liberal education core framework or due to the EDI expectations. Of that 40% who adapted or developed a course, 27 people, or 75%, said that they increased the amount of reading materials related to EDI or social responsibility. 75% said they increased. As you can see, some kept it the same. No one decreased the amount of content. And so for the survey respondents who did adopt or develop a course and then did increase the content, that is equivalent to about 1/3 of survey respondents overall. Sharing a little bit about the focus group, I had 13 volunteers, I had 6 people attend, and there was a wide representation from departments. The departments represented were social work, geography, communication sciences and disorders, nursing, and American Indian Studies. And the focus group didn't explicitly ask questions about diverse materials or campus diversity initiatives. Of course, everyone participating had already taken the survey. But participants mentioned in response to a question about how instructors select course readings, one respondent said, "Whose voices do I incorporate into my courses? EDI trainings over the past year have helped me realize I need more diversity, women and people of color." Of course, EDI trainings have been part of the EDI expectations. There are increased opportunities for professional development. And so this instructor is saying, I've attended those trainings and then I've learned as a result that I need to diversify the voices that I'm including in my course readings. Another response, another said in response to a similar question about selecting a course reading, "The library ordered a video about Native boarding school trauma. Students hearing voices about people of color helps promote familiarity and comfort. It helps humanize the voices of Native people." And this comment in particular is illuminating and regarding the reasoning for a format for choosing video, but also mentioning that the library provided access in this case. And okay, now I'm going to move on to results from the ebook, the quantitative part of the study. As you can see from my fancy graph here, the rate of use of EDI related ebook titles over 3 years slightly increased. It went from 17% to 19%, with a small dip in the middle. I'll go to my next slide to continue to talk about this. Moving to some less grand discussion and conclusions, but other things I found in this study. Ebook stats, I found to be inadequate to really make conclusions or correlations. Yes, there was a slight increase in the rate of use of ebooks related to EDI, but the usage stats cannot tell us what influences an instructor's choice, why they use a specific article or book, how often they change it out. And so one thing I noticed when looking at the ebook stats was there's very little repeat usage year after year. Is that because the instructor stopped using this? Or is it because they grabbed a PDF of the ebook chapter, put it in Canvas for their students, and then never had to grab that from the library again, therefore not making any more use stats through the library? Additionally, there is some usage that doesn't have 6,000 ebook chapter downloads like the Late Homecomer that maybe had 5 or 10 or 15. And this, I can't say is curricular use or not. It could be a student researching for a paper. It could be a faculty member researching. It could be someone just reading for professional or personal interest. It's nearly impossible to interpret the usage stats at a level other than just looking at these numbers and saying, yes, this one was used or use or increased. On the flip side, the qualitative methods in this research project produce more meaningful results. As a result of the survey and the focus group, I know there are instructors at UW Clare who are responding to campus diversity initiatives, and they're changing their curriculum materials they assign to students. They're adding more content related to EDI. We know that the library providing access to electronic content increases the likelihood that instructors will assign it to students. And going back to that same conclusion, for those who either adapted or developed a course, 75% are incorporating more materials related to EDI. And I said this already, instructors are more likely to include content from the library if it's available electronically. All of these findings are somewhat consistent amongst the different data collection techniques, and would suggest that the findings are reasonably valid. I feel a little weird saying that. Maybe it's just because I'm an early career researcher, but yeah, so that's my research project. I forgot one thing on this slide here. Up to 75% swap out a quarter of their content. So we know instructors are continuously changing content. I have some references on this screen here that have been very helpful. I'd like to say, in conclusion, I'd like to thank my research mentors in this project, Robin Miller and Kate Hinnett. Gave me a lot of direction and guidance initially when I was starting this process, and provided their survey expertise, which is much appreciated. And I would like to thank ORSP for not only having me today, but also for funding in some of the conferences I've attended to share this research. And if any of you have maybe took this focus, we're in the focus group, or we're survey takers, or we're notes recorders, I appreciate your help in this project. So that's the conclusion of my presentation, and I'm happy to take questions.
Thank you, Roxanne, for your presentation. So again, if you have questions, you can unmute yourself perhaps and ask. We are, I think, a relatively small group, or if you prefer, type it in the chat box. Clearly, your work, Roxanne, is, I think, showcasing the productive collaboration between the library and the other parts, if you will, of the campus that have certainly an instructional mission. I think there are two questions. Mel is on my screen, so maybe Mel can ask first. Sorry, Joe. Next is you.
Hi, thank you, Roxanne. Appreciate the presentation. Early in the presentation, you showed some data from one resource, and you showed the number of titles from 2015 at about 3, and then you showed the number of titles 2018, and I don't remember exactly how much it went up in the top 20 to 9 or 12 or something, and from one data source, and that sort of inspired you to pursue the project. So then when you did the quantitative part, you showed that there was about 14 to 19% ebook usage after the new LE was adopted. And you said something like 12,000 titles. Have you looked at, or do you plan to look at, comparable data for the 3 years before the LE was adopted, so that you have a comparison group? Because while the line dipped a little bit, it may be that whole line is much higher than the line would be if you looked at the 3 years before the transition. Just curious what the next step is for the project.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks for that question, Mel. I didn't talk too specifically about why I chose the years I chose, and there's some of the reports are really specific. I chose these 3 academic years because they sort of related to, you know, after the LE core and the EDI expectations, and I sort of mentioned that already. But additionally, those are 3 years that our ebook offerings at UW-Eau Claire through the library were stable. And we didn't make any large changes to any packages or subscriptions. Of course, there are ebooks being added during that time period, but no major changes. And then additionally, the usage stats that I referred to, and there's a standard for them within librarianship. It's called, there's an acronym. The acronym is COUNTER. It's for Counting Online Networked e-Resources, but there's an agreed upon standard that vendors provide these standardized stats to libraries so we can understand and compare from publisher to publisher, apples to apples. The standard that I was working with was Release 4, and that was those 3 academic years. I got data for 5 different publishers or aggregators, and I couldn't get some data before that. And at this point, that data might be gone too. So I may not be able to get that. Recently, the counter release is changed to release 5. And so we're in a transition mode of like trying to compare release 4 to 5 and also learning 5 and how it's different. And it definitely is an improvement, but it makes it even more difficult to compare years. Additionally, there's been other tumultuous things that have happened since 2018, since when this project started in 2019 when I did the survey. So I don't think it will be possible for me to go back and get the earlier years, mainly because the data is provided to us by those vendors and publishers. Sometimes there's only a certain period that they allow us to get that data. It varies by vendor. Some vendors, we can get it back for like 10 years. Some people, it's like the last 2 years. And if you didn't get it in that time period, then you're out of luck. Or maybe I could email them. But that was the reason I went with these 3 years. Yeah.
Okay, thanks.
Jill?
Thank you. Thank you, Roxanne, for an excellent and important research presentation. I think this is information that would be of use and of interest to our administration to talk about this initiative. The question I have, you mentioned that 40% of instructors check to see if the library provides access to content in their decision to include it in their course. I'm wondering if you got a sense of whether that's checking to see if it's already available or if the library can make it available.
I think I'm trying to think back to the exact wording of that question too. I don't think it was phrased either way. It was just like, do you check? I would guess that it's checking to see if we already have access. Of course, from our perspective is if we don't have access, then we'd want instructors to submit, a purchase recommendation so we could get it. Of course, we don't know if that always happens, and as much as we'd like it to. But yeah, I would guess it's more of like just checking to see if it's available. Although, I mean, I do get requests through liaison librarians and from instructors that are saying, I want to use this for my course, can we get it? But I think the majority is probably just checking to see if the library has it. But I have to talk to the rest of my library colleagues too, because they facilitate a fair amount of those questions and purchase requests too.
Great. Thanks, Roxanne.
So Karen has a question. Karen can feel free to ask. I just want to say that, I know it's 12:50. If folks need to leave, we understand. So, but Karen?
Roxanne, you in your focus group, you did have someone from geography, which spans science and non-science. Do you have a sense of whether you have data from scientists in your, anywhere in your study?
Instructors who are within the sciences. Yeah. I just looked at the raw data again yesterday. I didn't. I wasn't looking at it with that perspective or lens. I was looking at it because I wanted to see. I was trying to remember if Barron instructors would have gotten this survey at the time, and I determined they wouldn't have. And the Barron's usage, the usage that comes from Barron Library is not included in the survey either. So I was looking at it for that reason. I would have to go back and look again. I don't know. I mean, part of me thinks that there is at least some representation from science because journal articles came up to the top. But then again, I could be sort of making my own estimation there of who would assign journal articles as a course required course material. Yeah, so I'd have to go back and look at the survey data to see what the representation of departments is. There was not a question asking what department you're from, and so I basically have to work from people's individual email addresses and then find what department that they work in. So
I think sometimes it's a little more challenging for scientists to know how to add EDI content to their courses. So I was just curious.
Sure. And there is also some of the questions were pointedly saying, you know, outside of a textbook. And so if there are instructors, whether in the sciences or not, that only use a textbook, some of these questions were not really even relevant to them. So.
Thank you.
Jill, do you still have a question? I'm not sure whether this was from before or this is a new question.
Nope, sorry, I can't see where my.
No, that's okay. Well, thank you again. Thank you, Roxanne, in particular, for sharing your work, and thank you everybody for joining us. And hopefully you can join us again next week. Have a great day.